This video covers deceptive cadences and plagal cadences. We'll first look at the two types individually before concluding with a few similarities between the two categories. First up is the deceptive cadence. This is a cadence that features a dominant going to a submediant, most often, or another possible variant involves a dominant going to a 4/6. In both cases, the expected bass scale degree 1, which would have arrived if the second chord in the cadence had been a 1 chord, is instead replaced with scale degree 6. Usually a deceptive cadence is followed by a stronger cadence, most often a PAC. And because of this, you have to look carefully at the context. Some progressions from 5 to 6 may merely be just deceptive resolutions that are still part of an ongoing phrase. And some circumstances are a little bit in the gray area. So we'll look at 3 different examples and compare their differences in strength. First up, we have J.S. Bach's Flute Sonata in E minor. Specifically, we're going to be looking at a segment from the very end of the second movement. Let's listen to this. This passage is in E minor. As we approach the end of the movement, there are 2 spots that we're going to look at. The first is in measure 68. Notice that this is a very standard run towards a cadence. We have a cadential 6/4 resolving to the expected 5/3, strongly implying that the beat 3 of this measure should have a tonic chord, reaching that 1 chord to resolve the harmonic tension. Instead, the 1 chord is replaced with a 4/6 chord. Notice how scale degree 5 in the bass steps up to scale degree 6 in the bass. Later, at the very end of the movement, we have the expected scale degree 5 going down to scale degree 1, which is this time harmonized with a 5 going to 1. Here at the end is definitely a perfect authentic cadence. We have the standard 5 going to 1, we resolve with scale degree 1 in the outer voices. The real question is, what is the status of measure 68? Some might call this arrival on beat 3 of measure 68 a deceptive cadence. It's a little bit debatable, partially because one could argue that instead of this really being a cadence that closes down the phrase, it is instead elongating the phrase, kicking off an elongation of the phrase. Specifically, everything from that moment through the next iteration of the dominant could be viewed as a cadential extension. Let's listen to this passage again. Next up, we have a selection from Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro. This is the 6th number in the opera. This passage that you see in front of you is at the end of the first big section of the aria. Let's listen to this. This passage is in E flat major. We're going to be comparing the ends of the 2 lines as I presented them here. The end of the first line features a 5/7, instead of going to the expected 1, going to a 6 chord. This counts as a deceptive resolution or deceptive cadence, as some people would call it. What's interesting, though, is what happens immediately after that purported deceptive cadence. Notice that both the text and the music rewind so that it matches what happened in the middle of measure 9. This gives the effect of feeling like we're starting over this segment of the phrase, as if the music is not completely satisfied with the tentative amount of closure that was achieved at the deceptive cadence. This time the cadential dominant is extended and embellished to the cadential 6/4, resolving to the 7/5/3, landing on the 1 right on the downbeat, which marks the perfect authentic cadence that closes down both the phrase and indeed the section as a whole. So in this case, the deceptive cadence has the impact of attempting closure, but there's still some resolution that has not been achieved. And the perfect authentic cadence that follows achieves closure. For this reason, again, this particular moment, while I think it's a little bit more convincing than what we saw on the Bach, its status as a cadence is a little bit debatable still. In such cases, I would go ahead and mark the deceptive cadence, but view it as participating in this longer gesture that is culminating in the perfect authentic cadence that closes down the passage. Let's listen again. Next up, we have the very opening of Haydn's Symphony No. 52. Let's listen. This passage is in C minor. The first 8 measures form one continuous phrase, culminating in a 5 chord going to a 6 chord. This is a very clear example of a deceptive cadence. This deceptive cadence is reinforced by 2 features. One of them is the rests. Now, rests by themselves do not articulate a cadence, but they can reinforce a cadence that has already been articulated, strengthening its sense of closure. The other has to do with the nature of the repetition in this passage. Measure 9 returns to material from all the way back in measure 1. So unlike some of the other examples, it's not just rewinding a couple measures or so. It's going all the way back to the beginning. And the nature of this particular repetition differs from that in the Mozart example in that the dynamics drop all the way down to piano with the repetition. So it seems to be more of a soft echo and remembering the opening idea than any attempt to correct anything left open by the deceptive cadence. Let's listen again. Now let's move on to Plagal cadences. Plagal cadence is created with a subdominant going to tonic harmony. So major 4 going to major 1 in major, or minor 4 going to minor 1 in minor. In either case, scale degree 1 acts as a common tone. Scale degree 1 is diatonic in both the subdominant chord and in the tonic chord. This particular cadence, the Plagal cadence, is most common in sacred music. A Plagal cadence often follows the stronger cadence, usually a perfect authentic cadence. Let's look at a couple examples. First up, we have the famous chorus from Handel's Messiah and the Glory of the Lord. This is the very end of the movement. Let's listen to it. This movement is in A major. You likely noticed 2 cadences in the passage shown. The first occurs here in measure 129. We have a 5 going to 1, reaching a perfect authentic cadence. The second is at the very end of the movement, which is marked due to this slow adagio tempo marking. Here we have a 4 going to a 1, marking a Plagal cadence. This separation of the Plagal cadence from the main body of the movement is very common in tonal music, especially in sacred music. Notice that here in the Plagal cadence, we have that scale degree 1 serving as a common tone, here orchestrated in the alto line. Like the Mozart example, each of the 2 phrases in this passage feature the same text. Unlike the Mozart, the Handel passage achieves closure first, reaching that perfect authentic cadence in measure 129. Then later, at the end of the passage, the Plagal cadence reaffirms that closure that has already been achieved in the passage. Let's listen again. Next up, we have a famous passage from Holst's Second Suite for Military Band. So this is the middle portion of the march movement, the opening movement to this piece. Let's listen. The passage opens in the rather dark key of B-flat minor. This passage, like many of the others we've looked at today, features two phrases, each of which end with a cadence. Some of Holst's music, including this piece, has moments that veer towards the modal as opposed to the tonal. And we see evidence of that in this particular passage. The first phrase ends with a minor 5 chord. I'm still going to go ahead and call that a half cadence, though it does have that modal quality using the A flat rather than the expected A natural if this had been more strongly tonal in nature. The second phrase ends with a 4/6 going to a 1, thus serving as a plagal cadence. Thus, the opening two phrases of this passage first feature an open cadence followed by a more closed cadence. Relatively speaking, a plagal cadence is more final than a half cadence because it does resolve back to tonic. Looking at this pattern, we see that that weak cadence followed by a strong cadence actually fits the criteria for a parallel interrupted period. That first phrase is serving as an antecedent, and the second phrase is serving as a consequent. Let's listen again. Last but not least, let's talk about a few similarities between deceptive and plagal cadences. So in both of these cases, the status as a cadence is highly dependent upon the context. Part of this is because both deceptive cadences and plagal cadences are usually paired with a more stable cadence nearby. Deceptive cadence usually delays the arrival of a perfect authentic cadence that might be a few measures later into the piece, whereas a plagal cadence oftentimes follows a perfect authentic cadence. There are exceptions to both, of course. In the Haydn example, we saw a deceptive cadence that was functioning pretty much as a standalone cadence. And in the Holst example, we saw a plagal cadence that was actually coming on the heels of a much weaker cadence before it. So it actually achieved more closure than the cadence beforehand. Nevertheless, you will find the pairs that are on this slide pretty frequently within the tonal repertoire. Particularly in the 18th century, deceptive cadences and plagal cadences are often dependent on stronger cadences nearby. This became less the case in the 19th and 20th centuries, where composers started experimenting with using deceptive and plagal motions in place of authentic cadences. Deceptive and plagal cadences are less frequent in the repertoire in general than perfect authentic, imperfect authentic, and half cadences. Nevertheless, they do serve fascinating tonal functions in the context of phrases and passages.